Professors FM.
I'm Bridget Stomberg.
And I'm Lisa DeSimone.
And this is Taxes for the Masses.
Today's episode is on tax research related to firm-specific tax subsidies.
In 2018, over 230 cities offered tax breaks and other financial incentives in the hopes of being the chosen location of Amazon's second headquarters. The Amazon HQ2 bidding war made headlines and caused many to question whether these types of firm-specific subsidies are worth it to the localities that grant them. In today's episode, we discuss recent research into the effectiveness of firm-specific tax subsidies and whether having more public information about these subsidies improves their effectiveness. Hello, Lisa.
Hello, B.
We are doing this episode on this particular topic today because you recently had a paper published about the topic in one of the top accounting journals. So first of all, congratulations on that.
Thank you. This one took quite a while. And by a while, I mean our first submission to the journal was probably back in 2019. And from what I can recollect, we started working on the paper back in like 2017. I know from my own personal experience, 8 years is probably the longest I've worked on a paper from start to finish. And so this one was getting pretty close to that. How about you? What do you think your longest paper is?
I think I know this. I think it is 7 years. And it is the paper that I started. It was my first year summer paper because when you're in the PhD program, you got to do a paper your first summer. That was in 2010, if I'm doing my math right, because we started in 2009. So
yep, sounds right.
First year summer paper was in 2010, and it was eventually published, I believe, in 2017.
Yeah, so publishing in academic journals is super fun.
Super fun.
How many papers do we currently have together right now? I know at least three.
I believe
three.
I believe it is 3.
Okay.
And they are all babies.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't even have a toddler. We have 3 babies running around the house. So maybe listeners in 2032, 33, we'll be sharing good news that at least one, I'm hoping more of them have found a home in an academic journal somewhere.
Cool. I'm just going to go ahead and bury my face in some cake to stem off the depression. I'll be back in a little while.
Understood. No judgment.
Thank you.
Okay. But just 1 second, before you go shove your face in some cake, going to need you here because this is your paper. So I'm going to need your knowledge to talk about this paper.
Damn. Okay.
You can just eat in the background. It's all good.
Okay.
Just can't leave.
I do that most of the day anyway.
Okay. It is one of the things I love about you because you are as concerned about where our next meal is going to be as I am.
Oh yeah, I 100% think with my stomach at all times.
And I love that about you. All right. So as we said at the top of the episode, we're going to be focused on firm-specific tax subsidies. I'm going to try to say that properly every time. And the one that's probably gotten the most attention was HQ2 back in 2018 when Amazon was shopping around for a location for its second headquarters.
Yeah, and that was kind of a fun story to follow. Over 230 cities tried to lure them. They ended up choosing 2 locations, Long Island City in New York and Arlington, Virginia, outside of D.C., but then there was so much local backlash in New York over concerns about overcrowding and rising property values that Amazon ended up backing out of New York and deciding to build all of it in Arlington.
So fast forward to 2023 when Amazon announced that it was actually pausing construction. So at that time, it had completed office space for about 14,000 employees, but it put a hold on broader community development projects like creating green space, establishing restaurants and retail outlets, and also an amphitheater.
And so this is a great example that gives rise to some of the questions we're going to try to answer today. Question number 1, what are firm-specific subsidies, right? Let's talk about what they are. And then 2, why do governments grant them? And I would say the biggest question, number 3, is do they pay off?
Okay. Love that. So to start, what are firm-specific subsidies? Well, they are exactly what they say they are. They are subsidies that are negotiated between a jurisdiction and a particular firm to locate operations, investment, or employment in a very specific location. So we've got lots of specificity about who's doing what and where. In the example that we've been talking about so far, state and local governments in Virginia put together a big package of benefits to attract Amazon's HQ2. And it's not just HQ2 that Amazon has benefited from, right? Amazon has received firm-specific benefits across the U.S. that total about $3.3 billion in value since 2018.
And that's like not peanuts.
It's not. Even
right?
for a company like Amazon, that's not peanuts.
That's exactly. Even for a company as big as Amazon, over $3 billion is not peanuts. These benefits can come in a variety of different forms. They can be cash grants, discounts on property payroll or income taxes, financing deals, help paying for infrastructure that goes around the project. You name it. If the state or local government controls the purse, it can offer these benefits to a company as a way of trying to get the company to come establish itself there. All right. So second question, why do governments grant these things? What do they get out of it?
Well, in theory, they are going to have the opportunity to attract new investment and new employment. And that not only is going to directly benefit an underdeveloped or a rundown part of town and any locals who get hired by the company, but it can also generate indirect or spillover economic benefits. So, for example, those newly hired employees are going to have more money in their pocket than they did before they were employed. And they can spend that money in the area at restaurants, retail outlets. They can buy a house. If they buy a house, they're going to have to pay local property taxes on it. They're going to have to pay local income taxes on their new salary. And they're going to have to pay sales tax on all of those purchases that they're making, again, assuming the state has all of these different kinds of taxes.
Yep.
So the idea is that all the, attracting the company there is going to stimulate economic activity, and that economic activity is going to generate more tax revenue for the local government than whatever it spent on the subsidy in the first place.
Which is a lovely theory.
Sounds good.
The problem is that in reality, sometimes the company doesn't follow through on its investment or employment, or at least not as much as it promised in order to get the subsidy. Amazon putting a pause on the larger project is just one very public example of this. In the case of employment, it might matter to the locality too, whether the company intends to hire a bunch of new people at their new facility or if they're just moving existing employees from elsewhere. And the company's plans may not always be super clear on any of this.
And like you said, Amazon's HQ2 is a good example of that. It's also a really good example of some of the potential negative consequences of increased economic activity. And that sounds sort of counterintuitive, but remember, New York didn't want Amazon in their state because they were worried that the subways would be overcrowded or more overcrowded than they already are. That property values would push out incumbent renters and owners. And, generally that Amazon coming in and building a massive new complex would actually make life worse for the people already living in the area.
Sure. And then add to that the downright nefarious potential that some politicians who control the purse strings maybe just want to hand out benefits to their friends and family and don't really care about any actual local investment or employment or having the subsidy pay for itself.
Yeah, we're addressing the question right now of why governments do this. And unfortunately, a very plausible explanation is just to curry favor with people or reward people who they are close with. Cronyism.
Yep. So that all leads to our third question today. Do these subsidies pay off for governments? And the good news is that we know from decades of research that subsidies like this can generate good economic outcomes. A variety of studies find an increase in employment and or wages following relatively large subsidies.
Okay, that sounds lovely. So what's the bad news?
Well, these bigger subsidies tend to get a lot more public attention. The press asks a lot of questions about the deal being offered to the companies. The public can get involved in monitoring the handouts like they did in New York and basically said, no, we don't want this. The public can get involved in monitoring companies to make sure that they actually follow through on their promised investment or employment.
Okay, so there really is a question of whether these subsidies are effective across the board.
Right.
The problem, like you said, or I guess the good thing about these bigger subsidies is that they are naturally going to get a lot of attention. So they're not really helpful in studying effectiveness and separating the subsidy from the attention, right?
Right.
So what we would like is a bunch of subsidies that are small enough that they're not necessarily going to capture the public's attention to the extent that Amazon HQ2 did. And if we could get really lucky, we would like to have differences in how much information about those subsidies is disclosed to the public by the granting parties.
And that, my friend, is exactly what my paper looks at.
Let's hear more about that. All right, so we're interested in whether firm-specific subsidies are effective in the sense that they generate investment or employment in a location after the firm is granted the subsidy. But we're also interested in whether the public's ability to monitor those subsidies, because they have enough information about the subsidies, what was granted, what the firm promised, et cetera, to be able to hold the firm and the government accountable. So to clarify, we're talking about the public, citizens like you and me, being able to make sure that both parties to the subsidy are holding up their end of the agreement.
Yep, and that's basically the research question we aim to answer in this paper, co-authored with Anish Raghunandan at Yale and Becky Lester at Stanford.
And to answer the question, you specifically ignore those really big subsidies like the ones that Amazon got, because as we just said before the break, those are always going to get a lot of attention.
Exactly. We intentionally focus on smaller subsidies for that very reason. Interestingly, there are also a lot more smaller subsidies than big ones, almost 85 times as many.
85 times?
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot more of them.
Okay.
So we have a nice big sample, and states do differ in how much information they require to be disclosed or collected about these subsidies.
And if I am right, the basic prediction is that more monitoring of the subsidies should lead to greater effectiveness in generating the outcome that the state is hoping that they generate, like levels of investment or employment.
Yeah, but it's also possible that more information won't help.
Okay.
It's possible that any information disclosed by a granting agency won't actually be useful information, perhaps intentionally, or perhaps they don't know what information would be most useful for the public to monitor what they're doing. Or maybe they don't provide this information quickly enough for people to actually take action on the subsidies that are being granted in time. Maybe it's easy enough for someone to find out this information, so having the granting agency disclose it doesn't provide any new information to the public at all. So there are a lot of reasons why we might not see this increased effectiveness with greater information about the subsidies.
All right. So the first thing you said is that it's possible that the disclosed information wouldn't be helpful, and maybe it would be intentionally unhelpful. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that a little bit more. How could information be intentionally unhelpful? Well, I could technically fulfill my disclosure requirement, but I can make it as obtuse as possible. I can use really big words, unaccessible language, so that nobody can actually understand what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. I could fill it out, but I could delay it. I could go like right up to the deadline. Maybe if the penalty is small enough or there is no penalty, I could go beyond the deadline so that people can't really monitor my behavior ex ante. Or I can choose to only disclose things that everybody could probably figure out on their own. So I'm not really providing any new information to the public.
Yep. Those all seem like things you could do. You could also do other things to get around the requirement to disclose altogether. So in many states, the requirements are at the subsidy program level. It's not a blanket requirement across all types of subsidies. So if there's a requirement to disclose information about Program A, say a statewide initiative to increase employment, but not for Subsidy Program B, say an initiative to restore historical buildings into commercial outlets, you could just provide a company a subsidy under Program B and avoid the disclosure requirement altogether.
And then you'd never know what the company actually did with the money that you provided them.
Right.
Okay, so in your study, you have a bunch of smaller subsidies that are not going to attract the attention of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. You've got differences across states in the amount of information that they are required to disclose about these subsidies. And I guess technically you really have differences across subsidy programs even within each state.
Yep.
So you have hit what we would call an identification jackpot. Got lots of good ingredients there to answer your research question. So what do you find?
Well, consistent with prior work, we generally find an increase in employment in a county after a company in that county receives a firm-specific subsidy. If you compare the cost of these subsidies to the increase in jobs or wages, we estimate that governments spend an average of $8,500 to $23,300 per job created.
All right. So if we think about that on a per job basis, average minimum wage right now in the U.S. is $7.25 an hour. If you hire a full-time employee to work 40 hours a week for, let's say, 50 weeks, a whole year, minus some vacation and holidays, that gets you to an annual income of just under $15,000. So if we can assume that not all of these increased jobs are minimum wage jobs, then you can probably conclude that the government cost per job is less than the income that the worker winds up getting.
True, but we noticed in the data that a lot of these subsidies we study come year after year. It's not like a company gets a subsidy from a state today and that's it. They tend to get the same subsidy for multiple years. And once we take that repeated cost into account, our estimates suggest the cost could be as high as $105,000 per job.
So we definitely want those jobs to be paying more than minimum wage for this whole subsidy thing to make sense.
Agreed.
Okay. So what are the differences in the monitoring of these subsidy granting offices within state government? Did you find evidence that more monitoring is in fact better?
Sort of. If we only look at reporting requirements within the government, meaning the legislative branch has to receive a report, for example, from the granting agency about the types and cost of subsidies being granted. If we look at these internal within the government disclosure requirements, then yes, more monitoring is better. This type of monitoring could produce the same increased employment as offering 1 to 2 additional subsidies of the same size.
Okay, so if I follow, putting that into context, talking about your year after year phenomenon that you mentioned.
Yep.
I think what you're saying is that the government could get the same benefit from offering the same subsidy repeatedly, let's say over 3 years. Mm-hmm. They could get the same benefit if they just offered a single year subsidy, but also required that the legislature receive and presumably review some sort of report on that subsidy.
That about sums it up.
Okay.
Yep. Having the government even monitor itself better leads to a big increase in the efficiency of these subsidies.
Okay, I would say that's a little bit unexpected. So then does it follow that offering public disclosures that would allow public monitoring would have even bigger benefits?
Well, that's kind of what we expected, but this is where things get a little weird.
I love weird results.
We actually don't find any evidence that public disclosures improve the effectiveness of subsidies.
Okay, that is a little weird, and I'm sure in the review process you were asked to speculate about why that might be.
Yeah, so let's go back to our conversation earlier about all the steps a government could take to circumvent this public type of monitoring, right? They could offer subsidies that don't have reporting requirements.
Yeah.
And we do find evidence that they do that. The granting of subsidies subject to public disclosure declines following the implementation of these disclosure requirements.
Interesting.
And incidentally, we find the opposite trend when we look at the implementation of the government's own internal disclosure and monitoring requirements. So basically, states substitute away from the programs that have this public disclosure towards programs that don't.
That is really quite interesting.
We also find some evidence that when the subsidies subject to public disclosure are granted, the granting agencies tend to delay the disclosures and only provide information on older subsidies granted like a few years ago, which is, not as useful for monitoring the current year's subsidies.
So it's not that the public information is necessarily hurting the effectiveness of the subsidies, rather that the granting agencies are good at avoiding disclosure that would be useful to the public monitoring these subsidies.
Exactly.
But if even internal monitoring within the government seems to help, couldn't we just write better laws or hold the granting agencies more accountable for abiding by the spirit of the disclosure laws and then, maybe improve the effectiveness of all subsidies?
I think that's a very, very reasonable policy takeaway from this paper. We need better laws and we need more accountability on the implementation of those laws.
I think you could make the argument for that in context beyond firm-specific subsidies.
Indeed, you could. Yes.
Time for the good, the bad, and the ugly. You want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'm just happy this paper is published. It was a process.
So yes, it was a long fought publication, but are you at least happy with the outcome, with the result? Editors out there, including you, put your earmuffs on, but sometimes the publication process doesn't always make a paper better. Do you feel like you got what you wanted and you learned what you wanted to know out of this paper after 8 years?
I do think the publication process made the paper better. I think we were pushed to explain some of the non-intuitive results around, why don't we find more effectiveness of the subsidies that are subject to that public disclosure? Sometimes when you're engaging in research, you end up with more questions than answers. Mm-hmm. And as an academic, I kind of like that.
Yeah. So would you say that one of the questions, because I guess what I would say to you is, do they really pay off? So I think it's good that you have some validation that the firm-specific subsidies, they're not a total waste of money, right? You're finding an increase in employment. You're finding jobs exist. But I guess if we could segue to the bad a little bit, like, how confident do you feel that they really pay off to the government?
Well, I don't think we're able to answer that question with our paper. We just really look at the cost per created job, which is only one piece, right? Yeah. We talked about this multiplier effect of that person gets that job and then they're paying perhaps some portion of local income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes. That's tough for us to quantify. And so we don't know if that's paying off for the government.
Fair point. Especially something like this that, as you said, not only has direct benefits, which are going to be much easier to quantify. Anytime that you're talking about spillover benefits, it's going to be much more difficult to get your arms around what's going on.
Yep. And I would say the ugliest part of this whole situation, the ugliest takeaway from the paper, is the fact that governments can basically circumvent their own laws. Like, that's not pretty. That's not fun.
No. And in your research, did you find any evidence that this is going to improve over time?
We do not have evidence that it's going to improve, but I have the hope that it's going to improve, because I just think, how long can a government really get away with not complying with their own laws? I feel like eventually something's going to have to give, and hopefully that something is, actual compliance.
Well, maybe your paper will be a step in making that happen.
Yes, for all 2 people who read it. Mm-hmm.
You just need them to be the right people.
Mom and dad. Well, that's all we have time for today.
Be sure to join us for more tax nerdery on future episodes of Taxes for the Masses.